For millions of years, early hominid evolution proceeded at a glacial pace. Biology adapted slowly to the gradual rhythms of the natural world, and for a long stretch of prehistory, our ancestors were anatomically and neurologically static. This chart tracks hominid brain volume. Around 2 million years ago, the flat line breaks and cranial capacity triples. But brain tissue carries an incredibly high metabolic cost, requiring a massive caloric investment to maintain. Nature doesn't allocate those resources by accident. To justify such an expensive biological investment, there must be a selective pressure, a survival threat or environmental driver powerful enough to force the species to adapt or die out. Yet standard environmental models struggle to identify a single pressure strong enough to explain this sudden neurological leap. The physical evidence is undeniable. We can clearly see the cavernous difference in skull capacity between early species like Homo erectus and anatomically modern humans. But the fossil record only shows us the resulting bone structure. It cannot explain the mechanism of the expansion itself. Ethnobotanist Terence McKenna proposed a radical alternative. He argued that the trigger for this rapid brain expansion was not purely environmental, it was pharmacological. McKenna's work focuses on a difficult question. What kind of catalyst is required to rewire hominid neurology in an evolutionary blink of an eye? The conditions for this dietary shift began with severe climate change. As Africa experienced widespread desertification, ancient tropical canopies shrank. Early primates were forced to leave the safety of the trees and navigate the exposed, arid grasslands. Driven by scarcity, these hominids adapted their behavior. They became omnivorous scavengers. To survive, they followed migrating ungulate herds across the savanna, relying on these hoofed animals for sustenance. This tracking pattern created a highly specific ecological intersection. Searching for dense calories, hominids routinely flipped over cattle dung to harvest the protein-rich insects living underneath. They also found something else. Psilocybe cubensis is a highly psychoactive mushroom that thrives exclusively in the manure of grazing herbivores. The active compound in these fungi is psilocybin. It is an alkaloid that easily crosses the blood-brain barrier, binding to serotonin receptors and heavily altering neural processing, visual perception, and cognition. This dose-response model visualizes McKenna's core framework. He argued that escalating amounts of psilocybin provided distinct evolutionary advantages, from improved hunting to the development of complex language. McKenna characterized the ingestion of these mushrooms as a consistent, culturally integrated dietary habit, a persistent biological pressure that drove human evolution. At the baseline level, hominids inadvertently consumed low doses of the mushroom alongside the insects they gathered during routine foraging. To explain the physical impact of this low dose, McKenna leaned heavily on 1970s psychopharmacology studies conducted by researcher Roland Fisher. McKenna interpreted Fisher's data to conclude that small amounts of psilocybin acted like chemical binoculars. He claimed the compound significantly sharpened visual acuity and improved edge detection. For a hunter-gatherer operating on an exposed plain, edge detection is the ultimate biological asset. The ability to instantly distinguish the silhouette of a camouflaged predator in the brush or accurately track the movement of prey dictates survival. Higher hunting efficiency creates a reliable surplus of food. In early hominin populations, a caloric surplus directly translates to lower infant mortality and higher overall survival rates for the group. This introduces the biological mechanic of outbreeding. The specific tribes consuming the psilocybin would naturally multiply faster, genetically outcompeting the rival groups who were not utilizing the compound. By providing a measurable edge in the daily search for calories, the mushroom embedded itself permanently into the hominid diet. As hominids recognized the physiological effects, ingestion became purposeful, pushing them into the moderate dose tier of McKenna's model. At this concentration, the physiological impact shifts. Psilocybin begins acting as a powerful stimulant to the central nervous system. According to McKenna, the primary behavioral outcome of this nervous system stimulation is an increase in restlessness and sexual arousal. This boundary-dissolving group ecstasy naturally encouraged communal copulation. From an evolutionary standpoint, this ensured rapid gene mixing, fortifying the genetic diversity of the tribe. This also required a total sociological restructuring. McKenna argued the psychoactive effects dissolved the rigid, violent, male-dominated hierarchies typical of primate behavior, replacing them with egalitarian partnership societies focused on communal care. The moderate dose effectively weaponized social cohesion. By replacing violent internal competition with communal child-rearing, these groups secured a massive reproductive advantage. The apex of McKenna's theory relies on the heroic dose. This is the realm of full, deliberate shamanic ecstasy and total ego dissolution. Here, the chemical assault targets the brain's signal processing centers, specifically Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the neural real estate responsible for speech comprehension and production. High doses of tryptamines often trigger glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. McKenna theorized spoken language began as a physical reflex to sheer neurological overload. Overwhelmed by intense sensory input and vivid internal geometry, these early hominids were forced to create syntax and audible symbols to externalize the alien visions occurring inside their own minds. Complex abstract culture followed closely behind. McKenna viewed early art, deep philosophy, and the first impulses of religion as direct byproducts of trying to navigate and communicate this shared hallucinogenic headspace. He coined a term for this, the enzyme of culture. In chemistry, a catalyst accelerates a reaction without being consumed by it. Psilocybin was the catalyst that accelerated the reaction of hominid cognition. In this framework, the modern human mind and language itself are the direct results of ancient hominid neurology being chemically engineered by the mushroom. The Stoned Ape Hypothesis is a captivating narrative, but modern paleoanthropology and evolutionary biology categorically reject it. The first issue is an absolute void in the archaeological record. Mushrooms do not fossilize. There is zero direct empirical evidence that early hominids ever encountered, let alone regularly consumed, Psilocybe cubensis. Looking at this side-by-side comparison, McKenna's foundational evidence falls apart. He claimed Roland Fisher's research proved psilocybin improved visual acuity, but Fisher's actual published data measured something entirely different: the severe alteration of visual space and the transformation of perception. In biological reality, an altered visual space involves spatial distortion and hallucination. For a hominid hunting dangerous game on the savanna, spatial distortion is not an evolutionary advantage, it is a fatal liability. Furthermore, McKenna's model misunderstands the mechanics of selection pressure. For a trait to permanently alter a species, a specific pressure must ruthlessly favor a genetic mutation over countless generations. An occasional, diet-based psychedelic trip cannot trigger the consistent, hard-coded genetic mutations required to permanently triple the size of a species' brain. The anatomical costs of an enlarged cranium, including incredibly dangerous childbirth and massive daily caloric requirements, demand a permanent, unforgiving environmental driver. A sporadic dietary supplement cannot foot that biological bill. Yet despite its severe empirical flaws, the hypothesis refuses to die. It survives in the cultural consciousness because it attempts to answer a profound philosophical craving that hard science struggles to satisfy. McKenna successfully identified the ultimate blind spot in human evolution. The fossil record can track bone growth and measure cranial capacity, but it cannot explain the sudden, explosive emergence of subjective experience, inner speech, and self-awareness. This is the core of his Archaic Revival, the idea that modern alienation stems from the loss of a primordial, boundary-dissolving group ecstasy found in these ancient rituals. While the exact trigger for our sudden brain expansion remains an evolutionary mystery, the broader understanding that highly caloric, heavily shifting diets shaped human development is an undeniable scientific fact. The Stoned Ape Hypothesis fails as rigorous paleoanthropology, but it endures as a brilliant reminder that human consciousness is strange, highly fluid, and deeply intertwined with the raw chemistry of the Earth itself. Entering the DMT state is a transition measured in seconds. It is a rapid disruption of waking consciousness that leaves the user's expectation of the physical world completely shredded. The initiation begins with specific acoustic phenomena. Many report the sound of a crackling flame or a crumpling plastic wrapper, followed by an intense, deepening hum that vibrates through the center of the mind. The surrounding environment then collapses entirely. The floor, the walls, and the familiar parameters of the room are replaced by an overwhelming presence that replaces the known world. This experience differs from most hallucinogens in its extreme brevity. In clock time, the entire event lasts only 10 minutes before the user returns to baseline reality. Rather than drifting into a dreamlike state, the observer feels launched into a specific, fractalized spatial geometry. There is a tangible sensation of tumbling forward into a higher dimension. This rapid transition characterizes DMT as an event that happens to the user, rather than a passive intoxication. The sheer speed and intensity of the launch prove that the world does not always follow the rules of familiar physical laws. Standard neuroscience views these visions as a chemical glitch, the result of a brain struggling to process a sudden influx of tryptamines. Terence McKenna proposed a different premise. He reframed the substance as an epistemological tool. In philosophy, epistemology is the study of how we acquire and validate knowledge. McKenna argued that certain states could reveal actual features of reality that are otherwise hidden. He compared the compound to a telescope. In this model, the chemical acts as a lens, allowing the observer to see through boundaries of normal perception to detect celestial bodies existing independently. This raises the question of verification. If these states were purely subjective, we'd expect a different vision from every user. However, independent users across different cultures and eras report remarkably consistent features. They describe the same geometry, the same entities, and the same architectural laws. The consistency of these reports suggests a structured space shared by multiple observers. This transforms the experience from a personal hallucination into a dataset that can be analyzed and verified. Arrival in hyperspace begins with the total dissolution of the boundary between self and world. The observer is embedded in a vast environment of intersecting geometries, appearing as luminescent, superconducting ceramics and glowing liquid crystal gels. This environment contains no white light or vague sense of oneness. It is not an empty, mystical void. Instead, hyperspace presents a domain of extreme architectural complexity. It is a space densely packed with information and intentional design that exceeds anything found in the ordinary universe. McKenna noted that this realm possesses a clarity and coherence and makes everyday perception seem vague. The space feels more real than the world we left behind. The hyperdimensional nature of the environment is immediate. The impossible angles and shifting perspectives imply the presence of spatial dimensions beyond our three-dimensional physics. Every surface feels animated with purpose. There is no empty space, only a constant, high-definition flow of data and intention. The structural complexity of this space forces the user to acknowledge its autonomy. It appears as a pre-existing ecology rather than a chaotic projection of the human subconscious. This ecology is inhabited. Upon arrival, observers often encounter what McKenna called self-transforming machine elves. They lack biological humanoid forms. They resemble rotating, mechanical Fabergé eggs of liquid crystal, constantly folding in on themselves to change their geometric shape. They exhibit a frantic, playful energy. They wait at the threshold, urgently trying to capture attention and engage in interaction. McKenna insisted that these entities possess genuine intelligence separate from the human ego. They have their own intentionality and appear surprised or delighted by the human presence. The clarity and alien nature of these entities differentiate the state from a dream. Unlike internally generated characters, these beings present information and behaviors that feel entirely outside the user's psyche. Encountering autonomous intelligence within a chemical state suggests human consciousness is capable of contact with entities existing outside our ordinary dimensional framework. The machine elves are constantly active, and their primary goal is communication. They aggressively attempt to bridge the gap between their world and the observer. Human communication relies on small mouth noises, acoustic symbols flattened into concepts. In hyperspace, this becomes visible language. Sound instantly extrudes into rotating, three-dimensional polyhedrons. Voices condense into physical objects, unfolding to reveal smaller interlocking shapes representing embedded meaning. An idea in this dimension can be physically rotated, examined from multiple angles, and literally inhabited. the observer sees what the entity means. Here, the boundary between meaning and being collapses. Understanding does not require translation, because the physical form is the direct presentation of the meaning itself. Visible language reveals that the boundaries between thought, sound, and matter are arbitrary. In this state, syntax and material reality become the same thing. From the perspective of hyperspace, human written and spoken words are seen as degraded shadows of a higher cosmic language. We inhabit a world where complex meaning is flattened into crude, low-resolution alphabets. McKenna viewed our capacity for speech as an evolutionary echo, the universe attempting to articulate its own nature through the human nervous system. He predicted that virtual reality is our attempt to recreate this state. By objectifying thought into three-dimensional space, we may eventually use technology to bypass the limitations of spoken language. Engineering a way to communicate through direct, beholdable meaning would allow for a sharing of experiential constructs. In this vision, technology acts as an agent to dissolve the boundaries between individual minds. This logic applies to reality itself. Language is not just a tool for description. It is a force that defines and limits the scope of human consciousness. Stepping outside of these arbitrary linguistic systems is presented as a form of liberation. It is a way to escape the narrow constraints of human history and cultural conditioning. The DMT initiation suggests that our intellectual constructs are not tools for understanding reality, but boundaries erected against it. For McKenna, breaking these structures is the prerequisite for encountering the domain that exists outside our linguistic categories. We have examined the biological and cultural theories of human origins, but to map the ultimate boundaries of the human project, we must look past the physical fossil record and examine the topology of time through eschatological systems modeling. This leads us to Terence McKenna. An ethnobotanist and philosopher, McKenna spent the latter half of the 20th century trying to deduce the exact mathematical shape of human history. McKenna's intellectual breakthrough occurred in 1971 during a psychedelic expedition to the Colombian Amazon. After ingesting massive quantities of Stropharia cubensis mushrooms, he began formulating a new system of time. Out of that experience, McKenna formulated a radical premise. Time is not a uniform, linear arrow shooting smoothly into the void. It is a fluctuating, uneven landscape with a specific topology. He argued that the universe operates as a deliberate engine. Its primary function is to generate and conserve increasingly complex systems over time. McKenna believed that standard physics was blind to this underlying topology. To map it, he turned to ancient divination systems, arguing that human intuition had already modeled these temporal fluctuations. The result was Timewave Zero, a highly structured effort to take the sprawling revelations of the psychedelic experience and quantify them into a rigorous mathematical waveform. To build this map, McKenna replaced the standard thermodynamic arrow of time with a dualistic framework based on two opposing forces, habit and novelty. Habit represents the universe's entropic nature. It is the tendency toward conservative, repetitive, and entropic phenomena. Novelty is the opposite. It is the drive toward complexity, manifesting as creative, disjunctive phenomena that drastically increase the interconnectedness of a system. McKenna proposed that the entirety of human history is the macro expression of a constant binary oscillation between these two forces. Accurately tracking the shifting ratio between habit and novelty creates a predictive model for future complexity. To find the raw data to power this formula, McKenna looked to the I Ching, a 3,000-year-old Chinese divination text. The system uses 64 hexagrams. Each is a stack of 6 lines, either a solid yang or a broken yin line. McKenna focused on the King-Wen sequence, a highly structured arrangement of these 64 symbols. He extracted data by analyzing the first order of difference. He looked closely at how many individual lines flipped their state from one hexagram to the next. Tallying these state-flipping lines generated a sequence of raw numerical values. Analyzing this number set, McKenna identified a striking statistical anomaly. In a random distribution, one would expect an even spread of numbers 1 through 6. However, there were 0 instances of a 5-line change, and the transitions yielding 2s and 4s were heavily optimized. He concluded this was not a random distribution, but an intentionally engineered code designed to map the natural flow of time. This chart shows the sequence of numbers plotted onto a standard XY axis. This creates a jagged up and down waveform. The complete sequence contains exactly 384 lines of change. That specific number dictates the length and shape of this baseline wave. McKenna identified a secondary mathematical correlation. 384 days mirrors 13 lunar cycles, which suggested the sequence functioned as a temporal calendar. To deepen the model, McKenna created a stereo-isometric reflection of the wave running backward and overlaid it against the forward-running wave. This overlap created a modular hierarchy. At every point on the grid, the forward and backward hexagrams paired up to sum perfectly to 64.
Using years of combinatorial math, he collapsed this multi-dimensional network of overlapping graphs into a single, unified line moving steadily into the future. Through this mechanical process, an ancient divinatory text was converted into a modern software algorithm. Applying these numbers recursively, feeding the math back into itself at every level, McKenna transformed the graph into a fractal. This logic means a small sliver of the wave contains the identical structure of the whole. McKenna coined the term temporal resonance to describe this fractal behavior, which is governed by a scaling formula based on powers of 64. Practically, this formula dictates that time repeats the exact same sequence of events, scaling them up or down in duration by a factor of 64. The pattern of complexity that unfolds over 2 billion years is structurally identical to the pattern that will unfold over a few weeks. The shape of time remains constant while the scale changes. On this graph, high peaks represent habit, corresponding to dark ages, routine, and cultural stagnation. Conversely, the plunging troughs represent novelty, mapping to massive leaps in evolution, rapid technological innovation, and new social interconnectedness. If you look at the macro trend, you notice the wave trends steadily lower and lower toward pure novelty. The wave's downward trajectory demonstrates that historical change is accelerating at a mathematically predictable, exponential rate. This chart shows the time wave algorithm mapped onto the timeline of human history. To move from abstract mathematics to a predictive model, the wave was tied to recorded historical data. McKenna calibrated the math by anchoring the deepest dips in the wave to universally accepted moments of high novelty. He established his primary calibration point by aligning a massive plunge in the wave to the detonation of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima in 1945. Working backward, he noted that other major events seemed to fit the wave's troughs: the emergence of Homo sapiens, the invention of agriculture, and the European Renaissance all landed in areas of high novelty. As the calibrated wave approaches the modern era, the fractal oscillations become incredibly compressed, mimicking the rapid acceleration of 20th century technology. The calibration indicated that the wave was running out of space, pointing toward an imminent collapse of linear time. At the absolute limit of the graph sits the zero date. Here, the line plunges straight downward, hitting a vertical asymptote where the measurement of novelty becomes mathematically infinite. McKenna eventually synchronized this vertical limit to coincide with the end of the Mayan long count calendar on December 21, 2012. McKenna proposed that the universe is teleological, functioning like a marble rolling toward the bottom of a bowl. In this model, the extreme complexity at the zero date acts as a gravitational strange attractor, pulling the present toward it with increasing force as we approach the final singularity. Waiting at the bottom of the asymptote is the transcendental object at the end of time. It represents a singularity that exhausts all physical laws, merging human consciousness with infinite complexity. The physical world did not end in 2012, but Timewave Zero remains a significant cultural artifact, a testament to the human attempt to decode a purposeful structure within the chaos of historical events.
Western civilization is a loaded gun pointed at the head of this planet. Terence McKenna wasn't known for mincing words. McKenna used the term Dominator culture to describe a specific biological state, a 10,000-year-old societal neurosis that took hold when we lost our ancient, symbiotic relationship with the natural world. This pathology is maintained through three primary mechanics: patriarchy, rigid social hierarchy, and an aggressive materialism that values the extraction of objects over the cultivation of life. The core delusion keeping this system running is the isolated ego. We have effectively fenced off the human mind from the rest of the ecological web, acting as if the individual is separate from the environment. The primary psychological symptom is profound alienation. Aldous Huxley described the nightmare of being incarcerated within one's own mind, a solitary spirit doomed to suffer in absolute solitude. Scaled up to a global level, this alienation produces a hyper-competitive environment where 6 billion people try to achieve happiness by standing on each other's shoulders and kicking each other's teeth in. In this view, the modern socio-economic engine acts as a terminal disease, exhausting its host precisely because it ignores the biological requirements of the human animal. But just as a physical body produces antibodies to fight an infection, McKenna argued that the global body politic generates cultural strategies to heal itself. He identified the subcultures of the 20th century as these societal antibodies, united by their absolute rejection of linear, rationalist dominator values. Rave culture functioned as an antibody designed to dissolve the isolated ego through collective trance and rhythm. Jazz served a similar function, using improvisation and deeply felt authenticity to shatter rigid societal structures. Even body piercing was a defensive response, a way of forcefully reclaiming physical embodiment from a hyper-intellectualized society. Tattooing acted as the literal etching of archaic, non-linear impulses back onto the human form. These seemingly disparate movements are driven by a single biological impulse: to return humanity to a world of magical, empathetic feeling. This immune response seeks to establish what McKenna called a partnership society. Unlike the Dominator model, a partnership society is defined by egalitarian social structures, gender balance, and a deep ecological symbiosis. This is not an argument for pure primitivism. McKenna did not believe in a literal regression to the Stone Age or the destruction of technology. The Archaic Revival is a forward-looking synthesis. It is the recovery of lost values, intended to help us safely steer the massive technological power we already possess. This raises a scaling problem. How do you apply a tribal partnership model to a planetary population of billions? McKenna's cure was unexpectedly technical: the internet and virtual reality. He viewed cyberculture as the literal exteriorization of the human nervous system, technology functioning as the real skin of our species. McKenna contrasted the limitations of spoken words with the clarity of three-dimensional communication in digital space. Entering another shared imagination cracks the wall of private experience. By seeing what another sees, the isolated ego loses its solidity, echoing shamanic plant medicines globally. When stripped of the drive to control, these digital networks function as a medium for radical empathy, dissolving the isolation that has defined our history. This is the ultimate synthesis, fusing ancient ecological connection with modern digital networks. The result is a fully integrated noosphere, a global system that has essentially woken up to its own planetary self-awareness. It is a world that functions much like a vast interconnected mycelial network, constantly pulsing with both digital information and biological life. McKenna noted that the money, the power, and the scientific understanding to end war and starvation already exist. The barrier isn't a lack of resources. It is the 10,000 years of conditioning that keeps us trapped in a dominator mindset. Our survival depends entirely on having the courage to change our minds, decondition ourselves from history, and actively build the synthesis.